Our track was mental models for advanced visual facilitation, and our goal was to really help people think about and explore the mental models that they use every day, the ones that they're comfortable with, and also learn how to really recognize when their clients or people that they're working with are using different mental models or metaphors. So we had some discussion, some activities around that. And we also wanted them to kind of think about how those metaphors could fit into a framework so they could understand the different possibilities for metaphors they could use. And also to really get into the question of when they're hearing someone talking from a deep framework that's really a deep part of the conversation, as opposed to when they're really just, it's a surface expression. It's just something to communicate in the moment and not an enduring metaphor.
In order to get it started, we reviewed a framework that was first described in The Image, a book by Boulding, who wrote it at the time advertising began to be popular. I think it was in the late 60s, but he described the differences between talking about a structure where parts connect but they don't change, like a building, and a machine or a clockwork where the parts move, and a cybernetic system which can adjust, like a thermostat. So these are all non-living metaphors. And you can hear in the background this boat going down the river is an example of a machine. But there are also four examples of living systems metaphors which have increasing complexity, like comparing things to cells. So when high-tech companies talk about things being viral, they're really thinking in that frame of reference. So these are parts that connect and move and adapt but also reproduce. And then you have plants which grow and connect in groups, like ecosystems and forests and gardens. And then you have your animal metaphors where things do all of that plus move around. And finally, human metaphors where we can actually have self-awareness. So we described these 7 basic ones and then invited people to think about their favorites and which ones they like to use with clients and whether or not they're locked into that particular metaphor or more supple and diverse. So Meryem's going to talk about that.
Yeah, well, it's we wondered why it was important for facilitators to learn more about metaphors and to understand better the client's metaphor. It's because we listen all the time, and there's a danger of projecting our own images and metaphors on what people are saying. So one of the things we want to know is when a person is using a metaphor like a tree or a tribe, or so this company is very difficult to work with. We want to understand exactly what kind of frame of reference they have, what kind of images they have behind this metaphor. And we describe the clean language method as a method to explore the real metaphor that people have in mind and what they've experienced. And we do that by asking very genuine questions like, okay, you describe a company like a circus. What kind of circus? And the person by himself or herself will give the details and bring all the characteristics of her own metaphor. And then we get a much deeper understanding of what he or she means by that. And then we can explore more. And that's, we discovered in the group that people had many metaphors. And behind a tree metaphor, there could be many meanings. Behind a journey metaphor, there could be many meanings. So it's a way for us facilitators to raise our awareness and to maybe improve our quality of listening and understanding.
Would you be willing to role play this?
Well, why not?
So I think this conference was like a rite of passage for a community.
Okay, you said this conference was a rite of passage. What kind of rite of passage?
Well, it's the first one that's international, and so there was all kinds of ceremony around honoring different countries.
Okay, so you talked about ceremonies. Could you tell more about the kind of ceremonies?
Well, for consultants, a ceremony would be have everybody who's from North America stand in one group, and everybody who's from South America stand in a group, everybody who's from Europe stand in a group. So we went around and stood in the groups, and that's a consulting ceremony.
So, is there anything else or anything more that you want to say about this kind of consultant ceremony you described?
Well, the main plenary session was all organized around a bouquet of flowers in a circle, which is, normally I would associate that with, a high ritual of some sort.
So you get the idea. It's in fact, David gave us many, many qualities and descriptions of the kind of metaphor he was using without me trying to interpret what he was saying.
Yeah. And some of the feedback that we got afterward from participants were how hard it is to use that very neutral kind of questioning, because it's very easy to say things like, oh, a ritual, you mean, or a rite of passage, you mean like when a young boy becomes a man. But that's putting my idea forward, and that can change the description of the metaphor that you're getting. So keeping your language very neutral is very important, but also it's very difficult.
We had one beautiful accident, which is metaphors can also be embodied metaphors, not spoken metaphors. And so when this whole thing started, they turned on some music signaling the start of the program. And Rachel, who said her role was to be a dancer, started dancing. So I started dancing, and we got the entire group dancing at the beginning of this activity, which ended up fitting right into the lesson we were trying to make, which is you can dance with ideas just like you can dance with your body.
Yeah, and in fact, many people came to me after the session saying that they had a really interesting experience and discovered many things about metaphors and how it is important in our work to develop more the competencies as graphic facilitators or facilitators in order to better work with our clients.
And on Friday, for the next track session, one of the things that I would personally like to do is really get more deeply into that question of, as a facilitator, when should you, or should you at all, when should you nudge the group toward a more difficult or more complex metaphor if you sense that the metaphor that they're using doesn't give them the whole picture? How do you help them make that shift to a more complicated, deeper, widen their perspective? Yeah.
And this brings up the whole question that ran throughout the whole session, which is, what's the difference between an embedded metaphor that's actually like an operating system and one that's just a figure of speech? And so when a whole group of people get stuck in a certain way of thinking, it may be that as a visual consultant, you might actually have an agreement with the leaders to have the group explore a different way of thinking in order to get a different perspective. So shifting the metaphor out from what they're used to using in an operating context can actually be a great way to do that.
Yeah, and we will also explore metaphors and different cultures, different countries, different continents, because metaphors some of them are very universal, but in the details they are not. And it's interesting, as we are working globally now with many different cultures, and here in Berlin it's a very good example. We are from many different continents and many different cultures. So when we use metaphors and mental models, we want to be sure that it fits with the people that we're working with, the metaphor and the real way of thinking. So it's their own instead of a good one that we like.
So this is what our session covered.